Welcome to the debate. Today, we're opening up Chapter 15 of Latif's Essential Guide, and we're diving into, well, what a lot of contractors find as the single most critical and maybe controversial part of being profitable in insurance work: general overhead and profit. You know, the classic 10% overhead and 10% profit, or 20% GMP.
Yeah, this topic really is where the rubber meets the road. I mean, getting GNP consistently approved is what separates a contractor who's perpetually struggling from a thriving professional operation that can actually build up some financial reserves.
Exactly. So the foundational question we really have to get into, the one that dictates whether a business is even viable long term, is this. Is the consistent application of that, say, 20% general overhead and profit percentage required on pretty much every single insurance restoration claim? We'd argue, yes, it is, because Xactimate's pricing is, at its core, a low baseline that just structurally fails to cover these necessary costs.
And, okay, I absolutely see the financial necessity. I do. But I take a different tack on the strategy. I'd contend that while GNP is legitimate and, yeah, required for a professional business, demanding it universally on very simple claims, well, it can create adversarial relationships, and I think it weakens your overall credibility. I'm advocating for a much more targeted approach, one that links GNP specifically to, documented complexity and those traditional triggers. That's how you get irrefutable approval rates.
I can see why you think that, but let me give you a perspective that's really just rooted in the basic economics of running a legitimate business. Professional contractors, I believe, must apply GNP to every single claim just to stay solvent. The proof financially is undeniable. Xactimate unit prices, I don't care what the line item is, they explicitly exclude general overhead, the G&A. To operate like a pro, you have to address that exclusion.
We're in agreement there. G&A is excluded, but let's be, really precise about what G&A is here. We're talking about the fixed costs, the ones that aren't tied to a specific job.
Precisely. We're talking about the unavoidable costs of just keeping the lights on, right? Office rent, utilities, paying your admin salaries, marketing, your accountant, the general liability insurance that protects the whole company. And yes, the profit margin you need for reinvestment, for new equipment, and for building those reserves you mentioned, for a rainy day or a lawsuit.
And those are completely non-negotiable costs.
Absolutely non-negotiable. I mean, think about a typical small roofing company. Let's say they have $120,000 in calculated annual general overhead. If they just rely on the Xactimate unit pricing, say they do a $15,000 roof job, that baseline covers materials, labor, some on-site costs, but $0 goes towards that $120,000 burden. If they do 50 jobs like that a year, they need an average of $2,400 from each job just to cover G&A before they've made a single penny of actual profit. So relying on the baseline price it's structurally flawed. It ignores how a modern business actually costs money to run.
I fully agree that $2,400 is necessary just to keep the doors open. If a contractor isn't capturing their G&A, they're doomed. My point, though, is that demanding that generalized 20% markup on a routine, single trade job that has no, discernible complexity, that immediately throws up red flags for adjusters who are trained to look for specific justifications. For maximum defensibility, contractors need to prioritize the 3 traditional, irrefutable triggers for O&P approval that are laid out in the chapter. First, multi-trade coordination. Second, substantial complexity, which usually means claims over $10,000 or $20,000. And third, acting as the verifiable general contractor who is managing subs.
But why insist on waiting for a trigger when the financial burden, the G&A, is there no matter what the job size is or how many trades are involved?
Because the most successful strategy is to secure your project costs through the mechanisms that are least likely to be challenged. I think we should first focus on itemizing job-related overhead, or JRO, costs separately. These are project-specific costs that are also not in the unit pricing, but they're tangible. You can document them.
Okay, so give me an example of a JRO that you would favor over just applying GNP from the start.
Well, we've talked about the LAB super line item for a project manager. If you're doing a steep roof, you can cite specific OSHA compliance rules like 1926.502H for fall protection, which mandates a competent person supervisor. That lets you bill that JRO cost directly. Or things like temporary fencing, porta-johns, dumpster fees, permits. Those are all itemized JRO. When you document those, they're almost always approved, and capturing those costs reduces the total amount you need to get back through that generalized 20%, which makes the GMP request, if you still need it, far more defensible later on.
That's a thoughtful strategy for, picking up smaller specific costs, but I believe you're creating a separation that doesn't need to be there. Xactimate itself confirms its published price is just a baseline. They literally state, and I'm quoting here, "There is no way to be certain that any published price will be appropriate for a specific contractor." I mean, that's their own admission that their price is incomplete. If the baseline is incomplete, then GMP, which covers the very structure of the business, has to be added to every job to make the contractor financially whole.
I acknowledge that statement and that the price is incomplete because, yes, general overhead is excluded. But we have to be meticulous here in separating excluded costs, the G&A, from the costs that are already included. You mentioned the unit price includes labor. Well, in that retail labor rate, Xactimate does include job personnel overhead, JPO.
And that distinction between the included JPO and the excluded G&A is, well, it's often lost on the contractor who's just trying to get paid fairly for the work they did.
It's the difference between profit and loss, though. JPO covers the crew's immediate needs. The crew truck costs, their small hand tools, consumable stuff like chalk or tape, the direct cost of their benefits. If we try to itemize JPO, we're double dipping, and that's a huge credibility risk. But when we itemize JRO costs that are truly project-specific, like, say, specialized scaffolding for high access, we are accurately supplementing for costs that Xactimate agrees are separate from both JPO and G&A. By isolating those tangible JRO costs first, we show a kind of surgical precision that's really hard for an adjuster to reject.
Okay, but that JRO strategy, it doesn't address the core economic problem of G&A. Let's say a simple roof job needs $500 in itemized JRO. Fine, that gets approved. But that $500 can't cover that contractor's portion of the accounting fees or the office manager's salary or the general liability insurance. Those G&A costs are a fixed percentage burden tied to the value of the work, regardless of complexity. So if you only apply GMP when a job is complex, how are you covering G&A on the 80% of jobs that are simple roof replacements? You're basically running 80% of your business at a loss or at cost, and just hoping the few big jobs float the entire operation. That is not sustainable.
You're presenting a really compelling mathematical case for G&A recovery, but I worry about the cumulative damage to the contractor's reputation. If a contractor submits 80% of their claims with a generalized 20% GNP that has no clear justification, they get known to the carrier as an automatic flag. And that leads to slower payments, more scrutiny, more adversarial negotiations, even on the claims that do justify O&P. My strategy is all about trying to avoid that flag entirely.
I think the financial stakes just override the risk of some mild pushback, as long as the contractor has actually calculated their overhead and can defend the charge. Let's go back to the financial impact you mentioned. For a contractor doing, say, 50 jobs a year, adding an average of just $2,500 per claim through proper supplementing, which has to include O&P, that translates into $125,000 in additional legitimate revenue.
That is transformational revenue. Yeah, it absolutely changes the trajectory of a business.
It's more than just profit. It's the difference between subsistence and solvency. That $125,000 largely drops straight to the bottom line. It could potentially double a small contractor's annual net profit without them having to go out and find a single new customer. I mean, that revenue is what funds the ability to replace old trucks, to afford better software, and most importantly, to build those financial reserves we keep talking about. If contractors skip O&P because they're afraid of pushback, they are actively participating in the race to the bottom, where their only edge is cutting quality and operating on razor-thin, unsustainable margins.
I completely agree that $125,000 is necessary funding. But relying on generalized O&P without documentation makes that money highly vulnerable. Chasing that profit without irrefutable documentation is what leads to accusations of improper billing. The goal has to be securing legitimate funds that can stand up to an audit.
So what specifically makes the universal application of G&P risky, legally or ethically, if we agree the underlying G&A cost actually exists?
The risk comes from how the percentage is applied. If a contractor includes known audit triggers, like applying G&P to non-material or non-labor items, like a markup on a markup, or trying to apply 20% to some admin fee that's already buried somewhere else, that raises the specter of improper billing and, potential fraud investigations. A carrier that spots a pattern of non-justified O&P on small claims will often use that pattern to deny O&P on the larger multi-trade claims. I know of cases where an adjuster, finding a weak justification on the O&P request, used it as leverage to push back on legitimate scope items, ultimately just slowing down or denying the whole package. The cost to your credibility is just too high.
Okay, so if we accept the G&A cost exists for every job, then the contractor has to be ready to articulate that. When they get an adjuster objecting to the 20%, maybe they come back with, we only pay 10% O&P, not 20% on a simple roof, the contractor has to pivot immediately to justification.
And what's the justification you'd recommend beyond just saying, well, it's my overhead?
The contractor needs to cite the established industry standards for multi-trade work, even if it's a single trade job, because they're establishing their professional standard. They have to break down the 10% O and the 10% P, emphasizing that overhead covers necessary professional staff, the admin burden of the claim itself, quality control, and the liability insurance that a legitimate company requires. They aren't just asking for a raise, they're asking for necessary cost recovery. The burden of proof is on them to show why their cost structure is different from that Xactimate baseline.
That is a strong defense, but the most definitive way to justify G&P is through proactive, irrefutable evidence. If you can clearly prove the specific multi-trade coordination that was required, the fight just evaporates. For instance, if your revised estimate includes both roofing and interior drywall, the contractor should submit documentation that details the sequencing, why the roof had to be dried in first, how the schedules for the two crews intersect, the specific time the project manager logged coordinating those two distinct trades.
So you're suggesting the documentation of complexity is the shield against that pushback?
Absolutely. Complexity creates necessity. And if an adjuster is still pushing back after you've documented all that complexity, let's say they agree to 20%, but then start nitpicking line items, that's when negotiation becomes a key skill. You have to focus on collaboration. Instead of escalating it into a confrontation over the total dollar amount, maintain a professional rapport. Offer more documentation, maybe time logs or certifications that show the specialized expertise needed for that complex job. That collaborative approach, it often leads to faster approval, and it preserves the contractor's long-term standing with that carrier, which is a valuable asset that's worth way more than the dollars on a single claim.
That teamwork mentality is, it's crucial for long-term success, but I am still not convinced that prudence should outweigh solvency. My position remains that the proper and consistent application of G&P is a non-negotiable financial necessity. The fact that Xactimate pricing is fundamentally just a baseline that excludes general overhead, that justifies its inclusion in every single claim. If you forgo O&P on routine jobs, you are operating at a perpetual deficit, no matter the job size or complexity.
And while I accept the economic reality that G&A must be recovered, I think achieving maximum approval rates and protecting professional credibility demands a more sophisticated approach. Contractors have to focus on itemizing that specific job-related overhead first, and then strategically apply the full G&P percentage only when there are clear, documentable triggers like multi-trade coordination or complexity to create an irrefutable justification. That disciplined approach ensures that the transformative revenue you talked about is legitimate and secured for the long term.
Ultimately, I think what we've really learned from Latisse Chapter 15 is that understanding the Xactimate system, that fine line between the included job personnel overhead and the excluded general overhead and profit, that is the true game changer. For contractors, mastering this difference is genuinely worth tens of thousands of dollars a year.
It's a profound concept, and it requires not just, understanding it in your head, but careful, documented implementation out in the field.
We really encourage our listeners to take these principles to heart as they continue their journey toward maximizing legitimate claim value. And be sure to tune in next time as we delve into the insights of the next chapter in this critical series.